Hello, and welcome to Two Pews in a Pod. Join us as we explore faith in a modern world at Evangelical Lutheran Church in Frederick, Maryland. Now, here is your host, Pastor Paul Baglios.
I'm Paul Baglios.
And I'm Megan Wyatt.
And we're happy to welcome you to this third of 6 planned episodes in our podcast under the theme of difficult questions that we have been asked by people of Evangelical Lutheran Church. And I'll say in advance, I don't know if any of this noise is going to pick up in the recording, but where we are sitting, we're in my office in the Hahn building on our church campus. Right outside our windows on the upper porch,
On cue.
Workers are hard at work rebuilding, repairing, replacing the porch, the back porch of the Hahn building, starting with the second level. So we are able to hear very clearly the sound of saw or sander, I'm not sure which, but hopefully you'll be able to hear our voices clearly enough over the construction noise. For this third episode, we're talking about a very difficult question indeed, and it's one that has been put to both of us by many people in many different situations. So we're going to summarize the question this way. Can God forgive the unforgivable? And let's put a little more context to that. So often when I've been asked that question, or the same question essentially in different words, people usually have in mind somebody like Adolf Hitler.
Yes.
Other people who have been found out guilty of horrible atrocities, even if they're not all on the sort of global scale of Hitler's atrocities. What comes to mind for you?
I was going to say the one I hear often is Hitler, but for me it would have been, I think one of the first examples that I had thought of would have been when I was an early teacher, a Newtown shooting, like school shooters. Like how do you grapple with that, having that experience, and especially of being in a school and looking at the windows and knowing the realities of like that is to me something that's unforgivable.
I have a somewhat obsessive interest in true crime and forensic investigation. When I think about this question, people who often come to mind for me are notorious serial killers, psychopathic murderers who delight in the destruction of life, all of which is unforgivable.
Absolutely.
Clearly, can God forgive the unforgivable? How do we grapple with this? How do we think about that question and make some movement toward, if not an answer, at least hopeful understanding and insight that isn't just illusory? It would be easy to say, no, that for some people, their atrocious acts means that's it, they're damned, they're going to hell, they're out, end of story.
I don't have to live with them, see them, share this world with them. Yeah.
But we are reminded, I am reminded when I think about that, none of us is the judge of any other human being, no matter how confidently we like to pronounce our judgmental assertions about who's in and who's out in God's favor. It's never as easy as that.
Yeah.
So what do we make of a question like this? As Megan and I had some conversation prior to recording to this episode, we were talking about framing texts. Again, a primary reason for us to be recording the episodes of this series is not to provide answers to these difficult questions, but to indicate through our conversation how we might think with Scripture to move toward something of an answer, however provisional.
Yes.
And so framing texts, we talked about a number of these. For me, one of the most important that comes to mind is the story of, we'll say, Paul's conversion. narrated in the book of Acts. But before he was known by that apostolic name of Paul, he was Saul. And he had quite a reputation for being a hunter, a persecutor, indeed a destroyer of...
And a proud one.
And proudly a destroyer of people within the early Christian community, thinking of this as a duty that he held in relation to God, and a life that demonstrated his loyalty to God by hunting Christians who he believed at the time were false believers, false confessors. And the book of Acts describes an encounter with the risen Christ in which he undergoes, as it is narrated in the book of Acts, something like his own Triduum experience. Struck blind, laid low for a period of 3 days, after which he comes into a new life, into a new identity, a new purpose, a new vocation. He who had been the persecutor, the slayer of Christians, becomes then the proclaimer of the gospel, becomes the apostle who, at great personal cost, ultimately costing him his life, became the first great missionary of the spread of Christian proclamation and Christian belief in the Mediterranean world. Quite a change. And the change is emblemed in the name change from Saul to Paul.
I'm smiling because this scripture was recent at the time of the recording, only a couple weeks ago. And when I was reading this with our children during their catechesis time, one of the little boys goes, "But how? How is God letting him?"
Yeah.
And is it the same Paul in the Bible that who wrote all the things basically? And we had this really funny conversation of acknowledging how difficult that is to even accept God's forgiveness, right? Of we all can be used. Yes, he did these terrible things, but let's look at that next step. And it was just a really funny conversation because I said, I know, I get annoyed about it too, and Jesus showed up to Saul, who didn't deserve it at all. And we had that conversation of let's live with that a little bit and let's talk about it and just say the hard thing, which is it was really hard to read that and say that someone who did all of that wrong got to see Jesus.
Well, and that struggle is evident even in the narrative as it's written in the book of Acts, where some of those, hearing word that Saul struck blind is being cared for, are saying, not this man. He is a notorious, vicious killer. Not him, not now, not ever. The point you make is so key. The risen Lord comes to him. He did not deserve it. And that's always part of how we must think about forgiveness. It is never deserved.
Yes, exactly.
Forgiveness that would be deserved is not forgiveness at all.
Yeah.
Forgiveness is always grace. It always gives what cannot be claimed.
And really, it was an act by Jesus showing up to Saul. Saul wasn't looking for that. Saul wasn't asking for that. Saul didn't really have a choice in the matter either. It was something that occurred to him divinely. And I think there's an aspect of that as well. Like he wasn't going to look for forgiveness or looking for a way. It just happened.
He recognized within himself no need for forgiveness. He believed, as he often says in his own writings, he believed, he was confident in his own righteousness.
Yes.
In the righteousness and the rightness of his convictions, of his actions, of his point of view. And then all of that was laid low.
Because we often do this thing when there are people, even in our lives, who hurt us and betray us, that we want them to want forgiveness.
Oh, yeah.
We want them to be ready for forgiveness. And I think this is that way that we're reading through Scripture to see that that is not, in fact, how this works at all.
Yeah.
That forgiveness is not work in that way.
That goes to a point that I've often made in teaching. I know this comes up in No Experience Necessary all the time. I have sometimes directly or indirectly referred to this in my preaching. It is the difference between a transactional
Yes.
theology and a relational theology. I think the faith of many people is, in its essence, transactional. If this, then that.
Yes. Exactly.
That somehow God and I meet each other at some midpoint where I bring something, God brings something. And for many Christians, they'll say, well, God brings most, but we have to whatever. We have to believe, we have to accept, we have to confess, we have to ask, whatever it is, before God's grace can be effective. And Scripture makes it clear that's not true at all.
Exactly.
Scripture does not bear witness to a transactional God,
Right.
but to a relational God. And all of the language in Scripture about covenant is really language about relationship, not transaction.
Right.
It's about reciprocity and mutuality. So coming again to this question, if we think about as one framing text, the story of Paul's conversion, Saul becoming Paul, the persecutor becoming the apostle, one of the important things to note is that there is a fundamental transformation that occurs. It's not that Saul, as such, is forgiven.
Right.
Saul is, in a very real sense, put to death.
Yeah.
I don't mean that literally. That's not the way the narrative in the book of Acts tells it, but it is a death-like experience. Saul, as he had been, ceases to exist, and a new identity, a new person emerges as an abrupt break in the story of his life. Forgiveness is never, ever just excusing or overlooking.
Right.
Forgiveness never leaves the forgiven person intact as they were before.
Or say that the acts that they did or somehow don't exist anymore.
Right.
Via forgiveness, those things didn't ever happen. And it's not that either.
You had preached here at ELC recently on another of the framing texts that we talked about previously, which is Peter's restoration.
Yeah.
Remember that when Peter hears Jesus talking about his impending arrest and crucifixion, he's always headstrong in every account, and he says, I will never, ever, ever deny you. Jesus says, yes, you will. Never, never, Lord. Peter insists, I would never deny you. Jesus says, you'll deny me 3 times. And in fact, he does. When he is recognized as a follower of Jesus, while Jesus is being dragged before his examiners, Peter denies knowing Jesus or having anything to do with him. And in one of the Gospels, this is so poignantly written, as Peter, for the 3rd time, is saying, I don't know who this guy is.
Yeah.
Jesus turns and looks at him, and he weeps. Then later, the Gospel of John talks about the risen Lord coming to Peter and saying to him 3 times, do you love me?
Yes.
And that threefold repetition of the same question is the restoration of Peter into relationship with Jesus. But again, we have to understand a fundamental change occurred. Peter, the denier of Christ, then becomes the bold proclaimer of Christ.
Absolutely.
Ultimately, as tradition understands, sharing crucifixion.
Right. And really restoring for Peter what he probably felt was a break within that relationship between him and Jesus. Because I can imagine what that would have felt like to realize that he was living into exactly his biggest fear. Because I would absolutely never do that. And yet he fell right into it. So that kind of the humility that he needed to, as well, that he carried to admit that before Jesus and to expect the worst and be met with, again, love and understanding and caring. That kind of reconciliation there, I think, is rooted in that relationship. And that is really what is drawing us into our relationship, I think, constantly with Christ, is that we are constantly, if we are coming to Jesus, right, that Jesus is meeting us where we are. But vulnerability is such a big piece, I think, of forgiveness and of this conversation. We have to be vulnerable and honest with ourselves. Because I think it's easy for us to say, well, I'm not that bad. I wasn't Saul.
Oh, yeah.
Right? I wasn't Saul. I didn't persecute. Hitler. Right? And
I never shot any children in a public school.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think it makes it, we often think of those big things, and yet reconciliation is a consistent thing that we need to be seeking, because in our day-to-day lives, we're always, in a way, we mess things up. And that's okay. Right? Because we have a God who meets us and wants us and is in relationship with us.
Well, and one of the framing texts that you mentioned when we were talking about this episode earlier is Psalm 51, which we use at the beginning of Lent, every Ash Wednesday.
Yeah.
And I think especially of the verse, "Create in me a clean heart, O God," which is a plea for God's grace to change me.
Yes.
And again, we can't emphasize strongly enough that the grace of God is a force of change and transformation. In our lives.
Yeah.
I will often hear people say, I don't like change.
And I love your response, which is?
You're going to love death.
Yeah. Either we change or we die.
But even in death, I mean, it's all change.
It's
decay.
Right. And sometimes you have to die to change. Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And there are many, what I'll say, are smaller deaths along the way by which the grace of God is changing us, helping us to set aside perhaps older understandings, answers to our difficult questions that may have served us for a while, but then we come to the end of the value of those answers. And the power of the question reemerges and leads us to seek deeper understanding.
I really liked the framing text that you had brought first, which was Genesis 45, the story of Joseph. And really, to me, it's because like what his brothers did to him was atrocious. And yet, to me, that idea of that broken relationship that he had, the people who were supposed to protect and care and provide for him betrayed him. And I think that's something we can all relate to. And that sense of retribution. He had every opportunity for retribution and did not, right? Did not take that again and again, because that was not at the heart of it. And you just kept thinking, but Joseph, come on, they were terrible, right? They sold you into slavery and accepted that you were dead, or worse than dead, a slave somewhere.
Sold you and then arranged evidence to tell their father that you had been devoured by a wild beast.
Yeah.
I mean, it was betrayal all the way around.
Absolutely.
It was a criminal act of the highest order. And if that story were a Hollywood movie, when the brothers arrive in Egypt, seeking refuge and sustenance because of the famine that has plagued their home country, not recognizing their brother, who now is second in command only to Pharaoh. If this were a Hollywood movie, this would be the moment.
Yeah, we're lucky it's not a Scorsese, because we know what would have happened.
That's right.
We know what would have happened.
Yep. Joe Pesci here, cast as Joseph, would be unleashing a torrent of retribution pent up. But that's not what happens.
Exactly, because that's not our God. That's not our God.
Our God is not waiting to unleash a torrent of retribution upon us. And the passages of Scripture that would seem to suggest that's what God does, again, all of those things are corrective and transformative.
Yes, absolutely.
So when we come, again, not to an answer to this question, can God forgive the unforgivable? That's up to God. I hope the answer is yes. And I understand that God's forgiveness will make a new creature out of whatever hideous
Absolutely.
monstrosity we may have in mind when we think about the unforgivable.
Yes.
That the serial killer, for example, is not merely forgiven.
Yeah.
The serial killer is put to death by the righteousness of God. And yet from that death arises a human being indeed in the image of God.
Absolutely.
The killer of school children, of whatever age, going into a public school with some sort of terrible weapon.
Right.
No, that killer is not simply forgiven. Forgiveness is not, that's okay, you're excused. No, forgiveness means death and resurrection.
Absolutely.
And ultimately, the answer to this very difficult question is up to God alone. But if we think with Scripture, there are reasons that we may hope for the ultimate forgiveness of all.
All of us. Absolutely.
And that is part of the ultimate transformation of us all. And it isn't only the school shooters or the serial killers that need forgiveness.
That need that.
Because we all think, as you said, well, they committed terrible deeds. My sins are not nearly as bad. Doesn't matter.
Does not. Yes,
We all
absolutely.
need transformation.
I love that.
Well, hopefully this may have been helpful or encouraging, inspiring, maybe head-scratching for you in some holy ways. If you've listened or watched, thank you for joining us.
Absolutely.
I'm Paul Baglios.
And I'm Megan Wyatt.
And we'll see you for the next episode.
This has been Two Pews in a Pod, a podcast hosted by the pastor of Evangelical Lutheran Church in Frederick, Maryland. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.